His hands traced the curve of my waist, sending shivers through my body. The room was silent except for the sound of our breaths, heavy and urgent. His lips brushed against my neck, whispering words that made my heart race. I knew this was wrong, so wrong, but the heat between us was undeniable. My wedding ring felt heavy on my finger, a silent reminder of the life I was risking. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted him. I needed him. And I was ready to burn everything down for just one night. Now, let me take you back to where the story begins. His lips curled into a wicked smile, a spark of mischief dancing in his eyes. "Do you like to play with fire?" he asked, his voice smooth and laden with challenge. A warm sensation surged through me, quickening my pulse. Heat flooded my cheeks. But for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile without hesitation. In that moment, I let thoughts of Michael drift away, choosing instead to focus on the man before me. I noticed his breath hitch, his pupils dilating slightly as vivid images played out in his mind. He was relishing this as much as I was, if not more. Leaning in close, I let my lips hover near his ear, close enough to feel the warmth of his skin. "Tell me, Daniel," I whispered, my voice dripping with temptation, "what would you risk for a taste of the forbidden? For a chance to do something unforgettable?" The world around us faded, leaving only the two of us suspended in this intimate moment. I had barely sipped my gin and tonic when I noticed him, sitting in the farthest corner of the bar, an anomaly among the usual crowd. Unlike the others, he didn't cradle a beer or wear the weathered face of someone who spent decades in places like this. Even across the dimly lit space, I could tell he was young, no older than 24. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, everything else seemed to fade. His smile was small and hesitant, as if he were as surprised to see me as I was to see him. My cheeks burned, the sudden fluster catching me off guard. There was something electric about that brief contact, a spark, an almost magnetic pull that I couldn't ignore. I turned away, attempting to gather my thoughts, yet I could feel his gaze lingering, uncertain but steady. Was he wondering what I thought of him, or perhaps waiting for a signal? Taking a slow sip from my drink, I mustered the courage to look back over the rim of my glass. Our eyes locked again, and this time I didn't turn away. I hoped that subtle glance conveyed I had noticed him too, that I wasn't immune to the quiet electricity simmering between us. I had caught his attention. He instantly broke eye contact, blushing as deeply as I was. Yet it didn't last long. Almost as if he couldn't help himself, his eyes flickered back to me, his lips slightly parted, a curious expression on his face, like a puppy eager for approval. After a few more hesitant stolen glances, he stood up. His hand gripped his glass a little too tightly, revealing his nervousness about whether he was making the right move. Yet there was something else too, an underlying confidence peeking through. He wasn't as timid as he initially appeared, and perhaps that intrigued me the most. "Excuse me, miss," he began, taking a step closer. "Do you mind if I join you?" His voice had a subtle, almost melodic accent, a hint that he wasn't originally from Boston, though he had spent enough time here to blend in. His speech carried an old-fashioned politeness, the slight tremor in his voice making me smile. "On one condition," I replied, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Only if you tell me why you're here tonight, all alone." I wondered if pulling him out of his comfort zone might reveal what lay beneath his polite, nervous exterior. He gulped, glancing down at his drink before looking back at me, his cheeks still flushed red. I suppose I'm here for the same reason as you," he said, his voice hesitant yet sincere. "Just needed a bit of a change." "Fair enough," I replied with a small smile, placing my hand on the empty seat beside me. He hesitated for a moment, then took the chair a bit too quickly, his movements almost clumsy, as though my gaze alone had made him jittery. There was something endearing about his nervous energy. He introduced himself as Daniel, and the name amused me. It had a timeless classic feel yet suited him perfectly. He was young, certainly, but there was an old-fashioned charm about him, something that reminded me of my own youth, days spent wandering the streets of Boston in second-hand clothes, with dreams as endless as the horizon. "So, what's your name?" he asked, his voice steadying a bit. "Have you always called Boston home, or have you had other lovers?" I smirked, deliberately tracing the rim of my glass with my fingertip, slow and deliberate. "My name is Isabelle," I purred, letting the sound linger in the air between us. "And yes, I've been intertwining with Boston for most of my life. But the city has changed, as have my appetites. The years have a way of making things more ripe, don't you think?" Daniel nodded, his cheeks coloring again. I could see the effort he was making to keep up, and it was delightfully charming. My husband, I said, my tone shifting slightly, never seemed particularly interested in my flavors. If anything, he spent most of his time trying to avoid tasting them. I leaned in slightly, the corners of my lips curving into a playful smile. But you, I let my eyes linger on his lips for a moment before asking, you don't sound like a Boston native. Where did you grow up? He paused, lowering his gaze to his glass as though carefully choosing his words, like someone selecting the perfect wine for a special occasion. I'm fresh from the countryside, Vermont actually, he said with a faint smile. But I was drawn to the city. Boston always seemed more stimulating, the kind of place where you could get tangled up and unraveled all at once. His words were deliberate, measured, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a restless energy beneath his calm facade. I leaned back in my chair, taking another sip of my gin and tonic, letting the warmth spread through me like a slow, languid caress. Boston can be like that, I agreed, my voice low and inviting. But it's easy to get tangled in all the wrong ways if you're not careful. You need the right guide. I smiled, letting the promise hang in the air like a tantalizing whisper. Daniel's gaze locked onto mine, his expression shifting, intense, searching. His lips parted slightly, forming a soft O as though he were on the verge of speaking but stopped himself. Watching him, I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Did he see just an older woman, someone easy to talk to, a passing distraction in his evening? Or did he see more? Someone who had lived deeply and carried scars? Who had spent too many quiet nights fading into the background? Maybe I was wrong. Perhaps he saw something else entirely. Maybe he saw that I was still alive, still hungry and burning, still yearning for something unnamed and undefined. Sometimes, he said, his tone smooth and teasing, you have to dance with the devil to truly know your desires. There was a spark of intrigue in Daniel's eyes, a hunger that betrayed the innocent act he was trying to maintain. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a deep, rumbling whisper that sent shivers down my spine. And what about you? Have you ever played with matches? The question caught me off guard, sending a thrill of excitement coursing through me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, never breaking eye contact. I hadn't mentioned my husband to Daniel, and at that moment I didn't care to. This wasn't about him, this was about me, about us. Oh, I've done more than that, I murmured, my voice a husky whisper. When I was younger, hungry, eager, I explored every dark corner, every hard-to-reach place. I would take any risk for a taste of ecstasy. I saw his breath hitch, his pupils dilating slightly as images played out in his mind. Leaning in close, I let my lips hover near his ear, close enough to feel the warmth of his skin. Tell me, Daniel, I whispered, my voice dripping with temptation, what would you risk for a taste of the forbidden? For a chance to do something unforgettable? He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to my mouth and then back to meet my gaze. I could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes, the temptation battling his reservations. I'm not sure, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He shifted in his seat, discreetly adjusting his clothing, but his next words were thick with unspoken meaning. But I think I'd risk a lot. His voice was husky with desire, and a potent mix of lust and anticipation filled the space between us as he searched for reassurance. A signal to guide him down this unfamiliar and exhilarating path. There was a vulnerability about him, a raw honesty that drew me in. It wasn't just about the physical attraction, it was the unspoken promise of feeling truly alive, of embarking on something daring and new. For a fleeting moment, my thoughts drifted to Michael. A twinge of guilt pricked my conscience, but it was quickly overshadowed by the electric connection I felt with Daniel. Like him, I was ready to take the risk. Without overthinking it, I reached out and brushed my hand against his. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a jolt of energy through me, making my spine tingle. It was a simple gesture, yet it held a significance that neither of us could deny. He didn't recoil. Instead, he glanced down at our hands, a hint of a smile playing on his lips as he considered the implications. Slowly, hesitantly, he intertwined his fingers with mine. He wasn't surrendering completely yet, but he was willing to take a step closer to the edge. A wave of excitement washed over me. This young man, who had unexpectedly entered my life, had awakened something deep within me, a part of myself that had been dormant for far too long. His presence made me feel vibrant, desired, and much less alone. We sat there, hands clasped, the silence charged with unspoken possibilities. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us suspended in this intimate moment. Finally, Daniel broke the silence, his voice soft yet filled with determination. "I want to kiss you," he confessed, his gaze unwavering. "I know it's wrong, it's risky. But I can't fight this feeling any longer." I offered Daniel a soft smile, a silent invitation to continue our journey together. "Would you like to take a walk with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, a nervous tremor betraying my excitement. He nodded, his gaze unwavering, as if he had already decided long before the words left my lips. Hand in hand, we stepped out of the ember and into the hushed Boston night. The rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, its delicate patter on the pavement a soothing soundtrack to our escape. Though the streets of Boston typically pulsed with energy, tonight they were eerily still, as if the city itself held its breath for us. We strolled toward the waterfront, passing the darkened storefronts along Hanover Street, their lights extinguished for the night. The Charles River awaited, its surface mirroring the soft glow of the moon hanging high above. Daniel's hand held mine firmly, his grip growing more confident with each step. I could feel the warmth of his body beside me, his excitement palpable as the fine mist settled on our hair. The world around us felt both surreal and intimate, as if we were the only two souls left in this vast city. With every step I took alongside Daniel, the image of Michael, my husband, seemed to recede further into the shadows of my mind. I stole a nervous glance at Daniel, his profile illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, the strong line of his jaw, the way his lashes brushed against his cheeks, and the glimmer of curiosity in his eyes as he took in the sights around him. It all captivated me. "Do you often find yourself drawn to this path?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. "Occasionally," I replied, a playful smile curving my lips. "But tonight, something feels different." My words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. The city lights danced in his eyes, reflecting a desire that mirrored my own. I felt a surge of boldness, a yearning to break free from my life's constraints. "Perhaps," I continued, my voice barely a whisper, "tonight calls for a detour." He squeezed my hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken adventure ahead. We continued walking, the silence between us charged with anticipation. The familiar streets of Boston suddenly felt new, exciting, full of possibility. As we walked toward the moonlit river, I knew this night, this unexpected encounter, was about to lead me down a path I had never dared to explore before. "There's something sensual about the river, don't you think?" I said, my voice soft as I gazed at the shimmering surface of the Charles, steady and sure. Daniel nodded, his eyes dropping to our intertwined hands. His thumb began tracing gentle circles on my skin, sending a tingling warmth up my arm. "I'm drawn to the river," he admitted. "I thought the city would feel overwhelming, but nights like this, they're quiet, intimate. The river feels like the perfect place to linger." We fell into a comfortable silence, the gentle rhythm of the water contrasting sharply with the rapid thrum of my heart. When I turned back to him, his eyes were fixed on me, soft yet hungry. "You're unique," he murmured, his voice a velvet caress. "I've never met anyone like you." I smiled, slow and deliberate, letting the moment stretch. "I imagine you haven't," I said, my tone teasing. "Women like me, we don't come out to play very often." He shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's not what I meant," he said. "You see things I don't. You understand things deeply, like you have this secret knowledge of the world that I'm only just beginning to grasp." "Maybe I do," I replied, letting my fingers trace the length of his, a silent invitation. "Or maybe you're just waking up to the world's pleasures." Daniel hesitated, his eyes searching mine, a question burning behind them. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, a husky plea that sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. "Is it okay if I lean in?" For a moment, Boston seemed to hold its breath, as though the entire city had been waiting for this very question. The sound of my pounding heart was deafening in my ears as excitement raced through me, setting my nerves alight. He was so young, so open, looking at me as though I were still the vibrant woman I used to be, the one I sometimes still found within myself. For a fleeting moment, reality pulled me away from our connection. I wondered if I should tell him about Michael, my husband, guilt whispering in the back of my mind, but ultimately, I decided it wasn't worth risking this fragile, electrifying moment. I slowly leaned toward Daniel, eliminating the distance between us until our faces were mere centimeters apart. His warm breath brushed against my skin, his eyes filled with a mix of desire and anticipation. I felt my own barriers melting away, the walls I'd built over years of complacency crumbling under his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of the river beside us. "But only if you're ready to be consumed." The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though he was nervous about making the wrong move. There was a softness to his lips, a tender hesitance that made my heart flutter. For a moment I worried he might find me too experienced, that perhaps the difference in our ages was more pronounced than I had allowed myself to believe. Maybe he sensed there was more to my story, that I carried the weight of unspoken commitments. He hadn't asked if I had a husband, and I wondered if he suspected, but then he raised his hand to my face, his fingers brushing softly against my cheek as he held me. His touch was warm and grounding, chasing away my lingering doubts. As the kiss deepened, I felt a surge of emotion, excitement, liberation, a rekindling of passions I'd long thought dormant. The world around us seemed to fade away, the distant sounds of the city dimmed, leaving only the gentle lapping of the river and the rhythmic beating of our hearts. I was struck by how alive I felt in that moment, standing by the Charles River with this unexpected stranger who made me forget about time and obligations. His innocence blended with a boldness that both intrigued and captivated me. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you," he confessed, his voice a husky whisper. A soft smile spread across my lips. "And was it everything you imagined?" I teased gently. He chuckled, his eyes never leaving mine. "More," he admitted, "much more." I sighed softly, a mix of contentment and anticipation swirling within me. "You make me feel something I haven't felt in a long time," I confessed, the honesty surprising even myself. "Tell me," he urged, his thumb tracing small circles on my cheek. "Alive," I said simply. "You make me feel alive." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in each other's embrace, the possibilities of what might come next hanging delicately in the air. The night was ours, and for once, I was willing to embrace the unknown. I felt Daniel relax into me, finally letting go of whatever had been holding him back. Our kiss softened as we pulled apart slightly, our foreheads still touching, breaths mingling in the quiet of the night. I didn't know how many chances I would have to savor moments like this. With Michael away for the weekend, my mind raced as I decided to take a step that would turn this fleeting connection into something more tangible. "Daniel," I murmured, my voice steady but full of promise, "would you like to come back to mine?" His eyes widened slightly, and I caught the faint flush creeping into his cheeks. Yet the confidence he had grown with me over the evening held firm. He didn't look away this time, instead he nodded, taking a deep breath as his hand tightened around mine. A flutter stirred in the pit of my stomach as he leaned in for a brief, tender peck on my lips. We rose together and began the short walk to my house, the sound of our footsteps punctuated by the soft rustle of leaves beneath our shoes. When we reached my street, I hesitated, stopping a few doors down from my house. A wave of nervousness washed over me as I considered what might happen if Michael were to return unexpectedly. The thought of our delicate connection crumbling under the weight of discovery sent my heart racing. I pushed the fear aside, remembering my earlier resolve. With a warm smile, I removed my hand from Daniel's arm and said, "Let's go." He followed me up to the door. The house was dark, and it didn't appear that anyone else was home. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, allowing Daniel to enter first. When I turned on the light, reality came rushing back. The house wasn't just mine, it was ours. The living room was filled with small reminders of Michael's presence, framed photos on the mantel, a jacket draped over the back of a chair, and his work boots neatly lined up on the shoe rack by the door. Daniel's gaze fell to the boots, his expression shifting. He winced slightly, the realization of my situation dawning on him. I swallowed hard, knowing I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. "Daniel?" I began softly, my voice steady but tinged with regret. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You're married," he said, more a statement than a question. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of my confession settle between us. "Yes," I admitted, "but tonight it's not about him, it's about me, about us." Daniel didn't say anything at first, his gaze flicking back to the boots before meeting mine again. The vulnerability in his expression made my chest tighten. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now," he admitted, his voice quiet. I stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to decide anything, Daniel," I said. I wanted to be honest with you. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I can explain, I began, my voice faltering. Daniel nodded slowly, the hurt flickering in his eyes. Though he quickly masked it with a more composed expression, he said, "You don't have to." He waved a hand dismissively, as if brushing away the thought of my husband entirely. "Are you sure?" I asked, uncertain whether he was still comfortable being here. Instead of answering with words, Daniel stepped closer, his hand gently resting on my back, pulling me toward him. With his free hand, he brushed his thumb lightly against my lips, tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was soft yet deliberate, and his thumb paused at the corner of my mouth, tilting it open slightly. "You are beautiful," he whispered, his voice carrying a quiet awe that sent warmth rushing to my cheeks. I felt myself blush, but for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile without hesitation. In that moment, I let go of thoughts of Michael, choosing instead to stay present with the man in front of me. Taking his hand in mine, I guided him to the sofa, where we sat side by side. As soon as we settled, his lips found mine again, this time with deeper passion. I felt myself relax, melting into him, the barriers I had so carefully constructed, finally giving way with each passing moment. Daniel's confidence grew, his movements more assured. The intensity of our connection surprised me. It was as though we moved in perfect synchrony, our hearts beating in time, our bodies wrapped together in a timeless embrace. I hadn't anticipated this. At 65, after 40 years of marriage, I never imagined I could find myself here, sharing such a profound connection with someone who looked at me like I was the most extraordinary person in the room. As the night wore on, we remained close, wrapped in each other's arms, caught in the quiet stillness of the early hours. It wasn't just desire that bound us, it was something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. As the first rays of morning light crept through the windows, illuminating the living room in a soft golden glow, we lay together in silence. Daniel's head rested on my shoulder, his hand entwined with mine. I closed my eyes, savoring the peace and intimacy of this fleeting, secret moment. It wasn't just about what we had done, it was about what I'd rediscovered, a quiet happiness that had eluded me for so long. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive.